Okay, welcome. This is my presentation on exertional rhabdomyolysis by George Kirkman. So we'll just get right into it, shall we? Exertional rhabdomyolysis is basically a term that refers to striated muscle which results in the release of muscular cell constituents in the extracellular fluid and the circulation. It's usually if you feel like you've got any symptoms like aching muscles, sore muscles, similar to DOMS, which is delayed onset muscle soreness, you'd probably visit, and you've been having really, dark coloured urine, then you probably visit the doctor. You probably should visit the doctors if it's persisting for a certain amount of hours, especially the dark coloured urine. That'd be one that I'd start getting worried about, and maybe make a visit to the hospital or the GP. It's usually diagnosed once you get to the hospital by abnormally high creatine kinase levels present in the body. The doctors will obviously do several tests, and that's one of the key things that'll show rhabdomyolysis. Basically, there's been the normal regions, I think, are 200 to 400, but there's been up to cases of up to 60,000, obviously in the body. So there's people who've, if you have creatine kinase in excess of 10 times the normal amount, it's indicative of exertional rhabdomyolysis. They'll obviously do more tests, but that's usually how it's done. So the symptoms of exertional rhabdomyolysis, such as there's several symptoms: dark reddish brown urine, similar colour to like Coca-Cola, muscle pain and weakness, muscle stiffness, and general fatigue. Going back to the case study, these are all relatable to the case study. The patient was saying he had leg cramps, which is relatable, as it's muscle stiffness. He then had pain walking and felt similar pain to delayed onset muscle fatigue. The pain then worsened, and Jack noticed the following morning that it was producing pee resembling a dark reddish round colour, which is indicative of rhabdo. So yeah, he had all the symptoms basically that are indicative of rhabdomyolysis. So obviously the doctors would have done some tests, and then from them tests found out that he'd had these. He also had a rise, it said in the case study, a rise in creatine kinase levels. So that is obviously also indicative of rhabdomyolysis. The effects of rhabdo, there's quite a few effects of rhabdo. Once a patient has been infected with exertional rhabdomyolysis, they will not always notice immediately. There can be excessive soreness and cramping during exercise, but this can just be mistaken for just pushing the body too hard, basically. Athletes always have a thin line which they're basically going to go over at some point, and people usually just mistake it for muscle soreness, and there's the old saying, go hard or go home. So people can just think, they're pushing the body, pain's going to happen. This is evident as well in the case study, as Jack had immediate pain and couldn't complete the set. But he then went on to have excessive muscle pain. He just thought it might just be DOMS, which is again delayed onset muscle soreness from training. So he thought, the best thing to do to sleep it off. But also, it says when he woke up in the case that he's having dark reddish round urine, similar to Coca-Cola. So that's when he got worried, and he made the trip to the hospital. It was the right thing to do. The effects can be similar to DOMS. Following effects, like I said, can be dark coloured urine, soreness and fatigue. Once noticing the dark coloured urine, it is best to contact a medical advisor and seek urgent medical attention. Dark coloured urine, again similar to the colour Coca-Cola, was shown in the case study. This is where he started to show more concern and eventually admitted himself to A&E. And the next slide. So the etiology of rhabdomyolysis. Rhabdo can be brought on by crush incidents and accidents. So car crashes, severe impact crashes, just anything that's a sudden crush injury or accident injury. However, in the case study, there's no mention of crush injuries or accidents, so in this case, this is not likely to link to the case study. However, there are many other causations of rhabdomyolysis, which I'm going to go through now. Rhabdomyolysis can be caused by sepsis, dehydration, and drug and alcohol abuse. However, none of these are mentioned in the case study again. As the case says, he actually says he prioritised hydration, so he's fairly unlikely this to be the causation of rhabdo. Like I said, he prioritised that, So it's very unlikely that that's going to be the cause. Although there has been studies that have shown that rhabdo is linked to dehydration and not prioritism that can lead to it. Rhabdo has also been noting a sudden increase in training duration. This wasn't present in the case study, as the patient has entered and completed a number of obstacle run races, as well as a number of triathlons, half Ironmans and full Ironmans, which obviously means that the patient is very fit. However, he has just gone to CrossFit, which is a change of sport, and he has been doing it for 2 months, but focusing mainly on lifting technique. So a sudden increase in CrossFit without being properly strength and conditioned for it can, lead to rhabdo, even though Jack may be healthy. There's clearly a link to excessive hard training and rhabdo, with many journals showing links. However, the case study patient was well trained, did not do excessive exercise from the case that was presented. More information will be preferred to see if it did any extreme exercise before this workout or in the days before this that could lead to overtraining and therefore lead to rhabdo. So if we were to go further into this, we'd have to see how hard Jack's set was, and also how hard he has pushed himself in the days before this, because like I say, it's usually a sudden increase of too much training. There isn't a high amount of evidence of which particular sport causes rhabdo. However, it has become increasingly common to see in lifting sports and sports such as CrossFit. It's very common in sports that push it to the limit, such as the military, and such as other things like the military and other things like that, which is obviously really, really tough training. Jack in this case, a study has recently taken up CrossFit and was partaking in a lot more weightlifting activity at high intensity that could lead to rhabdo. We'll move on to the diagnosis of rhabdo. So rhabdo is diagnosed in a hospital setting, tests are carried out to make the diagnosis. So you go into the hospital, tests will be carried out, and symptoms are presented by the patient such as muscle soreness, muscle stiffness, dark reddish urine. Rhabdo would usually be diagnosed if the creatine kinase levels were excess of what we consider normals, which is usually known as 10 times the normal amount. They can also test the urine to see if there's any blood present in the urine, which is common symptoms of rhabdo. This was present in the case study as the patient was experiencing dark-coloured urine the day after the exercise, and also experienced the muscle stiffness and soreness, and will be presenting these symptoms to the doctor. The most common treatment for rhabdo is IV fluid replacement, followed by rest to allow the creatine kinase levels to return to normal. If you usually just resting in the hospital and having an IV drip can usually reverse the effects, and then within a certain time frame you can obviously go back to sport, and then eventually go back to normal, and then eventually go back to sport. So the mechanisms of rhabdo. Rhabdo has symptoms similar to DOMS. This is similarly reported in the case study, who says he has symptoms similar to DOMS, so it could be mistaken by the patient as this was just thinking they have sore muscles from training. The symptoms are usually present after training, but can worsen over time, and if left untreated can lead to serious health conditions and even death. Obviously in severe cases if you're not acting on what's happening. Severe stress and dehydration have been shown to increase the chances of a person getting rhabdo, which is backed up by various research, such as military training camps, due to the excessive exercise and excessive amount of exercise in the sport they put the body through. Rhabdo is also more common in less trained individuals, or individuals taking up a new sport, such as the case study with Jack taking up CrossFit. Although well trained and a fit individual, taking a heavy CrossFit exercise with a lot of lifting can lead to rhabdo being present and increase the chance of the condition happening. We'll move on to secondary problems. Although rhabdo elicits severe muscle pain for up to 36 hours before the injury, and there are no studies that show that it has any long-term detrimental effects on the individual's competing exercise. As long as the patient is hospitalised, as soon as the symptoms become present, exertional rhabdo can be treated and the symptoms will gradually improve. These usually involve the patient being put on an IV drip. After between 3 to 8 days in hospitals, with obviously varying severeness and varying fitness of the individuals, obviously that can reduce or increase the time in hospital. But within 3 to 8 days generally, the hospital, the symptoms have reduced, the patient is usually sent home from the hospital, and studies have shown that within 2 to 5 weeks, the majority can return to their pre-rhabdo sport levels. However, in some cases, it has been shown that exertional rhabdomyolysis can lead to compartment syndrome. This is because the damaged muscle can swell excessively. This can sometimes require surgical intervention, which can lead to a much lengthier spell out of sport. So obviously you want to get this caught quickly and be sorted out. Can the risk be reduced? Exertional rhabdomyolysis is usually brought on by intense bouts of exercise. Early cases of exertional rhabdomyolysis from military training, which involved rigorous training and was associated with heat stroke and dehydration. However, exertional rhabdomyolysis occurring... Oh, sorry, I've missed it on here. However... However, exertional rhabdomyolysis occurring in the absence of heat stress and dehydration is becoming more common. With the trend to CrossFit becoming increasingly more popular, there has been a rise in the number of hospital admissions and diagnosis of exertional rhabdomyolysis. In relation to the case study, the competitor, though, was relatively consequently being at more risk of ER, and therefore the case study was a greater risk of ultimately being diagnosed with ER. This is because Jack had recently took up CrossFit and was starting intense workouts when his body hasn't quite adjusted yet. It says in the case study that he's been doing CrossFit for 2 months, but focusing on mainly lifting technique. More information will be required for this to find out how much exercise he's doing and how intense he's pushing his body. There's only very little exercise information in the case study about how much exercise he's doing. Would need more information to see how much he's actually pushing his body. He's been doing CrossFit for 2 months, but if he's just been focusing on lifting technique them whole 2 months, you'd need a lot more information to find out how much he's been pushing his body, because you can get accustomed over 2 months, but obviously you need a lot more than that to be fully accustomed and pushing your body to the limit, so we need more information. Anyway, can the risk be reduced? Continued. It is very well documented and known that people who are unconditioned, who suddenly take up a sport or heavy bouts of exercise, are more at risk of developing exertional rhabdomyolysis. Therefore, one way people can reduce the chance of developing exertional rhabdomyolysis is to gradually ease into the sport. Doing too much intense exercise, which, whilst relatively unconditioned, is going to greatly increase the chances of being diagnosed with exertional rhabdomyolysis. This is also shown in the case study. Although Jack was a very fit individual, he was quite new to CrossFit, doing too much exercise too early and too much intensity predisposed him to a higher chance of being diagnosed with ER. Once again, we'd need more information to show how hard he is pushing himself, but as it says, he's only been focusing on lifting technique for 2 months, so he's not been pushing his body too much. So if he's then just gone straight into this hard exercise and pushed his body to the limit, it's going to obviously increase your chance of being diagnosed. Doing intense bouts of exercise is also known to increase the risk of developing exertional rhabdomyolysis. Although this is usually necessary to improve performance, hydration and heat should be closely monitored, as there is clear evidence between heat stroke and dehydration playing a factor in someone being diagnosed with exertional rhabdomyolysis. To reduce the chance of this happening, hydration should be closely monitored and prioritised. In the case that Jack took part in the exercise in the gym, which is likely to be cool conditions, and also mentioned that he prioritised his hydration, so this is unlikely to have been a factor in Jack being diagnosed with exertional rhabdomyolysis. Therefore, although there are precautions that can be taken to reduce the chance of Jack developing exertional rhabdomyolysis, there is no way of completely ruling out the chances of developing exertional rhabdomyolysis. So we'll move on now to return to sport. There is currently no evidence-based guidelines of return to play to sport after an episode of exertional rhabdomyolysis. There are some studies that show it takes a certain amount of time to return to sport, but there's no clear guidelines at the moment of when they'll return to hospital, when they'll return to sport. Obviously, there's going to be different levels for different levels of players. Some players will recover quicker, some people will recover slower. Obviously, like recreational athletes might recover slower, and top level class athletes might return quicker. But there's still no guidelines at the moment. So more research could be done into this to have clear guidelines of when to go back to sport and when to return to sport to make this less likely to happen. So some athletes may be at high risk or low risk of regained rhabdomyolysis after the first time and also getting in the first place. The athletes at high risk should be evaluated for myopathic disorders. There are various tests that can be done to do this, such as electromyogram, genetic testing, muscle biopsy, exercise challenge, and caffeine halethane muscle contracture testing. Testing should be carried out to see if someone is more at risk. In low-risk athletes, a gradual return to sport is likely acceptable if the patient is symptom-free, well-hydrated, and the creatine kinase levels are normal. As well as the myoglobin being no longer present in the urine, and the urine being of a clear colour when expelled, as well as there being no muscle pain. Although there are no evidence-based guidelines, athletes tend to be back to sport within 2 to 5 weeks and no further complications occur and no surgical intervention is needed. Obviously, this can differ between the level of athletes and the age and genetic things, which how people recover, how quickly people can recover from sports. Elite athletes are likely to recover rather a lot quicker than recreational athletes. In relation to the case study, Jack, after recovering in the hospital, would likely be discharged once his markers were close to normal and would likely return to sport once the necessary recovery protocols have been met, such as no muscle pain, clear urine, and myoglobin levels being normal. We'll just continue on from this. As there is currently no evidence-based guidelines for return to sport following an episode of exertional rhabdomyolysis, it is hard to know for a coach or therapist to know when to return to the athlete back to the sport, although there are markers to say when they should be able to return. Therefore, more research is needed for there to be an evidence-based guidelines that can say when an athlete is ready for the sport following admission of ER. For example, if someone's being diagnosed, it'd be nice or good for a sports coach to know when their athlete is ready to go back into training, or a manager to ready, because you don't want to push them and then put them at risk of developing this again and having another bout outside of sport, especially if this person is a professional or this is a career that they're making out of this, because obviously then it's imperative to get this person back, but keep their chances of getting rhabdomyolysis under control. One of the takeaway messages is, if you are worried about this, don't be worried about it. Just concentrate on your hydration, your hydration, and keeping yourself cool. Obviously, you need to do high bouts of exercise to improve anyway, which is, you want to do high bouts of exercise to improve. So you're going to have to do that, but there's, it's very unlikely to happen. And this is the reference list. I don't know if you can see that very well, but yeah, that's the reference list. I'll just zoom in a bit. Yeah, that's the reference list. Thank you for listening. I appreciate that. And that is the presentation over. Thank you and goodbye.